welcome to the Deadly Digest, the show about psychos, sadists, and serial killers. I'm your host, Delaney Bartlett, true crime writer.
I'm C.F. Roberts, local writer and jack of all trades.
And today we're going to take a look at the Central Park Jogger case and the real perpetrator of that crime, Matias Reyes. So Chuck, do you want to tell us a little bit about this here?
Yeah, I'll lay the groundwork. Okay, April 19th, 1989. Tricia Miley, wealthy investment banker jogging in Central Park, was raped, beaten, and left for dead. And she was found at 1:30 a.m. in the morning. At the same time, a dragnet happened around the park following a number of assaults. And just to give you a kind of a rundown on all of that, a competitive bike rider hassled about 9:05 p.m. by the group, one of whom tried to punch him. A 52-year-old man walking in the park near 105th Street was knocked to the ground by teenagers at about 9:15 who stole his bag of food and bottle of beer. He was left unconscious but soon found by a policeman. A couple riding on a tandem bike were attacked on East Drive south of 102nd Street at about 9:15 p.m. by boys who tried to stop them and grab the female. The couple called police after reaching a call box. The remaining victims were attacked by members of a large group while jogging near the reservoir. A banker was attacked and robbed about 9:25, 9:40. And another attack happened around 9:30 p.m. Yet another attack happened around 9:47 p.m. A 40-year-old teacher severely beaten and kicked in the head about 9:40, 9:50 near the reservoir and left unconscious. He was also robbed of a Walkman and other items. Three of the victims were black or Hispanic. Most of the suspects, complicating a narrative attributed to the attack solely to racial factors. And another question I had here with all this is this larger group of kids in the park did not necessarily seem particularly unified. Were they acting as a mob, or did they all just happen to go to the park at the same time? It's been established only two of the Central Park Five even knew each other. How much of what was happening in the park was group activity, and how much of it was just, a bunch of randos doing their thing?
So those are really good questions that we'll never know the answers to, because that group, that provided the perfect cover for Miley's attack. Because the cops that were being called in, they were all looking for this large group of teenagers who were committing all these attacks all around this area in Central Park. And so when Reyes left, he was wearing Tricia Miley's headphones that he had stolen from her. And he strolled out of that park. He actually encountered a cop on his way out. And they just chit-chatted, and he strolled on his way, because they were not looking for anybody. They were looking for this large group of people. Mm-hmm. And it continued to provide cover for him later, because from that moment on, they were just convinced that Miley had been attacked by the same group of people, even though they were in a different part of the park from where Miley was attacked. Mm-hmm. And so you lived near New York City at that time, right?
Yeah, well, I didn't even live in New York City. I lived in New Hampshire, which is maybe a 5-hour drive away from it.
Okay.
But, sociological point for the time frame, yeah, I didn't even live there, and I, along with most people I know, were aware. And it's I almost hate going here, because I feel like it kind of veers into the territory of victim blaming.
Right.
But everybody I knew, and I certainly knew, you don't go into Central Park after dark. If you do, you're asking for trouble. And the amount of assaults that happened that night kind of bears that out.
Right. And it was known at the time. She did interviews with Oprah and I think Larry King.
Yeah.
And they both said the same thing. And in fact, they actually kind of questioned her on it enough to where it did start to kind of sound a little bit like victim blaming.
Yeah.
But she said she just felt invincible. She knew it was dangerous, but she sort of felt invincible. And you know, she's a very wealthy woman. She was a investment banker at Salomon Brothers. She'd attended Wellesley and Yale, Phi Beta Kappa. And again, like, not blaming her for it, but she probably, as someone who had a great deal of privilege in her life, she probably did feel pretty invincible at that point, and maybe didn't take that as much caution maybe as somebody else who was closer to that type of violence than maybe she had encountered. I mean, that's just kind of the way I sort of can wrap my mind around it, because you're right. It was, even in Arkansas, it was known like Central Park after dark. Like, that's just, you just go there to be murdered. That's the only point.
I mean, maybe it's different now maybe it's now like post Giuliani. It's like the Disney store out there, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not there.
Yeah.
But okay, just going into this whole thing here, because as we go deeper into this case, and shortly here we're going to get to these, the very well publicized Central Park Five. But one thing that came out of this, it was real big when this attack happened, was the idea of wilding. I just saw that all over the media. There was sensationalistic, screaming headlines, "Night of the Wilding," and I just want to know, is that a thing? I mean, have you ever heard of such a thing? I mean, it almost felt to me like it was something that was supposed to make me afraid as a white person or something. Just the wilding.
Right. And it does play into that, portraying them as animals.
Yeah.
I mean, so I was like 16 at the time, which was right around the age of the Central Park Five, a little bit older. And I mean, I heard it. Again, I was all the way here in Arkansas, so take that as you will. But I only heard that term in connection with this case.
Yeah.
And I hung around with a bunch of hoodlums, and we never used that term. I mean, it was kind of a joke, because it just sounded so obviously like something adults would say that teenagers would say, right? Like, it just kind of showed that typical clueless, kids these days, they're out of control.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was kind of a joke.
Okay, so 14 or more suspects were taken in and questioned. 6 defendants indicted on May 10th for melee, rape, and unrelated assaults. The 6th defendant pleaded guilty to the lesser charges and received a reduced sentence. But now we're going to get to the Central Park Five, and these were the 4 minor kids who pretty much bore the brunt of public scrutiny. These kids were indicted in the attacks. Antron McCrae, who was 15 at the time, Kevin Richardson, who was 14, Yusuf Salam, who was 15, Raymond Santana, who was 14, and then Kerry Wise, who would later change his name to Corey, was 16. Out of these 5 kids, only Salam and Wise knew each other. The 5 were indicted after coerced confessions without counsel, which they later recanted. No physical evidence was available to place them at the crime scene. DNA evidence belonging to another party was excluded from the evidence.
Which is important, and we will talk about later.
That's important. The 5 were convicted despite a lack of physical evidence in 1990. 4 juvenile defendants served 6 to 7 years each. Kerry Wise, the 16-year-old, was tried and sentenced as an adult, and he served 13 years in an adult prison.
Yeah, in an adult prison. A 16-year-old boy in an adult prison. And not just any adult prison, Rikers Island. The same Rikers Island that was too icky for Paul Manafort. Yeah, that Rikers Island. Anyway, their convictions were for assault, robbery, riot, and rape, and some other associated charges, but yeah. So, yeah, speaking of Donald Trump.
Speaking of Donald Trump, okay. Donald Trump got involved in the legal case. During their trial, he paid $85,000 to buy a full-page ad in the New York Daily News, newspaper of note, and he condemning the assault and demanding the death penalty.
Yeah. And all it did was just added to this frenzy that the media was kind of whipping up about these wild teenagers. And they really just used a lot of dehumanizing language, treated them like animals, talked about them like they were animals. And once again, like in the West Memphis 3 case that we talked about last time, check out our first 3 episodes.
Draw a lot of parallels.
There's a lot of parallels, yeah. So, yeah, that action by Donald Trump was sort of the cherry on top of that shit sandwich to torturously mix the metaphor there. So, but that's going to do it for the first part of this case of the Central Park Jogger. Next week, we're going to talk about the actual attacker, Matias Reyes. So, see you next week on the Deadly Digest.